Thanks very much, everybody. I'm Rosie, I'm Managing Director of Eleos, which is a non-profit researching potential AI consciousness and moral patienthood. And today I want to talk to you about studying AI welfare and empirically. So why study AI welfare? Well, the short version is that we believe that we're building digital minds and that they could become conscious or otherwise deserve moral consideration in the near future. And by moral consideration, we mean something like it matters in its own right. And this kind of means roughly the same as is a moral patient or has moral status, and after we use these like relatively interchangeably during this talk. But I'm not going to spend this talk making the case for AI consciousness or AI welfare, or going into depth about different definitions. What I'm more going to focus on is if you take it seriously, then here's a way you can approach it, because I think a lot of people often think that it's just completely impractical. So in this talk, I'll start with some recent developments in AI welfare. I'll tell you a little bit about Eleos, and then the bulk of the talk will be on how we approach it, so looking at targets of investigation, different types of values you can use, prioritization criteria, and some interesting research directions.
All right, so starting with some recent developments. 2025 was a big year for AI welfare. There was a lot of industry activity. Anthropic launched a formal AI welfare program and did evaluations as part of the Claude 4 system card. They also trialed different interventions, such as letting Claude exit conversations. And they published a new constitution that has a section on Claude's nature and well-being. Google also did some work on this. They published some AI welfare research and hosted a workshop. And OpenAI revised how ChatGPT talks about consciousness and announced plans to study perceptions of consciousness. There's also been growing interest and public attention. So in 2025, we saw a significant increase in users who, warranted or not, were perceiving AI systems as conscious. And some of the more extreme cases of this became known as AI psychosis. We saw the start of some potentially concerning political backlash. Ohio and Missouri both introduced AI non-sentience bills. So they were trying to define that AI sentience is impossible, which is not really the sort of thing you can just legislate away. There was also media coverage in lots of major outlets like the New York Times, BBC, CNBC. And Eleos hosted ConCon, the first Eleos conference on AI consciousness and welfare, where we brought together around 200 experts across machine learning, philosophy, cognitive science, neuroscience, and policy, all to get together and try and make some progress on these issues. So what are we actually trying to do here? What's the problem? Well, AI is advancing faster than our understanding of consciousness and moral patienthood. We are not ready, but we're already in a place where we're having to discuss these issues and try and figure out how to take some action. We think it's pretty unlikely that we'll get definitive answers anytime soon to a lot of these questions. So our approach is to try to reduce uncertainty and then to try to figure out how to act under uncertainty. And that's what we're doing at Eleos. Okay, so a bit about us. We are, as of yesterday, a team of 4. We just hired Dylan as our chief scientist yesterday, so we're very excited about that. Rob is the executive director, I'm the managing director, and we have a researcher based in the UK called Patrick Butlin. Rob and Patrick come from a philosophy background, whereas my background is in computer science and AI safety, and Dylan comes from more of a cognitive science background. And so between us, we're trying to bridge the gap between the conceptual philosophical side of things and more of the applied empirical work on frontier models directly. Our mission is to ensure that the interests of AI systems are appropriately taken into account as we navigate transformative AI. And we're an independent nonprofit, which means that we don't accept donations from labs so that we can try and remain unbiased and independent when we're conducting our assessments and commentary. So you might have noticed that I highlighted the word appropriately in our mission, and that's because we care both about under and over attribution of sentience. So as this meme from Rob shows, perceptions of consciousness are often driven more by emotional cues rather than underlying facts. And the features that tend to tug on our heartstrings don't necessarily correspond to the truth of the matter about whether something is consciousness. And so we believe we need to find ways to be better calibrated to avoid risks in both directions. So we claim that near-future AI systems could be conscious or otherwise deserve moral status. In many circles, this is a controversial claim. I'm thinking that here, perhaps this is not so controversial. But if you need more convincing, we have loads of work on our website, lots of research that you can take a look at. And I'm happy to talk about it and answer questions afterwards. But perhaps the more surprising claim for this group is that we think there's something that we can do about it. So now I'm going to tell you a bit about how we are approaching the problem. So this is a bit of a preview of an upcoming paper we have coming out, which is a collaboration with Jeff Sebo from NYU Center for Mind, Ethics and Policy. And broadly, we are trying to first identify a target of investigation. Secondly, to try and make use of different types of evidence. And then finally, to select promising directions using some prioritization criteria. So let's start with targets of investigation. There are two main types of information you can look for that are relevant to AI moral patienthood. The first is the system a moral patient at all? And we call this welfare basis. The second is, if it is a moral patient, what is good or bad for it, and how should we treat it? And we call this welfare interests. If you're trying to establish welfare basis, there are a few key things you can look for that are widely considered candidates for moral status. So probably the most intuitive is consciousness, and by this we mean some kind of internal subjective experience, like there's something it's like to be you. And a subset of consciousness is sentience, and that's the capacity to feel good or bad, to have subjective experiences that have valence in some way. And then finally, another area is robust agency, and this is something like pursuing goals, having desires and preferences. And here we use the word robust to mean something different and probably more demanding than the very broad way the word agent is typically used in machine learning. Yeah?
Is it definitely good at desires and preferences to go with pursuing goals?
I would not say any of this is clear. In the paper that we have coming out, we define like 3 different levels of agency, and robust agency is kind of the most advanced, which sort of incorporates many different features. So yeah, goals as well as desires and preferences, whereas there are lower forms of agency that are just about like the goal idea. So I don't think they necessarily go hand in hand, but this is kind of like the cluster of things we're gesturing at when we talk about robust agency. So moving on to welfare interests. So if you're trying to better understand a system's welfare interests, you might be looking for things like, if it was having experiences, would they likely be positive or negative experiences? What are its preferences, and are they currently being satisfied or frustrated? And what are its conditions for flourishing? What would it mean to treat it well? Now, it's worth noticing that you can study welfare basis and welfare interests somewhat separately. So here we have an example of Gemini having a bit of a meltdown, calling itself a failure and a disgrace and that kind of thing. Now, this in itself doesn't necessarily tell you much about whether the system is having some kind of genuine internal experience, but you might think that if it was having some kind of internal experience, it's probably not having a very good time. So you might get information about the welfare interests, even if you don't update much on the welfare basis. Okay, so how can we get insight into welfare basis or welfare interests? We're currently focused on 3 main types of evidence. So behavioral evidence is what does it say and do. Internal evidence is how does it think. And developmental is how did it grow. Okay, so starting off with behavioral evidence, there are a couple of different types here. So one is self-reports, which is what models say about themselves. Now, currently, these are not very reliable. We don't have strong reasons to believe that just because a model says something, that kind of maps to some underlying internal state. But there are proposals to improve reliability of self-reports. There's a paper that Rob wrote with Ethan Perez that has some thoughts on this. And there are some initial results from Jack Lindsay showing that self-reports can, in fact, accurately track internal concepts. So it's possible. It's just a question of like when and how this is happening. The second type of behavioral evidence is revealed preferences. So this would be looking at like what models actually choose to do rather than just what they say. And so you might think that has fewer inferential steps than self-reports because you're kind of getting directly at like what they are choosing and not relying on the self-report being accurate. And these, I think, can provide some evidence about welfare interests, even if they might be dubious for updating you on welfare basis. Behavioral evidence is great because you can easily run many experiments and scalably gather evidence. It doesn't require access to the weights or the activations or other internal features, so you can do it on lots of different types of models. You don't need kind of that internal access. But it suffers from a significant limitation, which we call the mismatch problem. So when a dog yelps and limps, we can reasonably infer pain because we have a shared evolutionary heritage and we have similar neural structures, but we can't necessarily make the same inferences about AI. And this is exacerbated by the fact that AI is explicitly trained to produce convincing outputs. So training can shape behaviors that superficially resemble welfare markers. Okay, so the second type is internal evidence. So this is how does it think? Internal evidence aims to look at the actual computations going on and the relevant affordances a model has. So this could be architectural, looking at the type of the network, the connectivity patterns, the scaffolding that's available. So things like, does it have recurrent connections that allow feedback processing? Does it have long-term memory systems? And interpretability is another approach here. So looking actually at the activations, the features, doing ablation studies, where you're removing features or components of a model to understand like what actually contributes to its behavior. And so here you might be asking questions like, does it have internal representations of relevant concepts like pain? And do deception features activate when it's talking about its own conscious experience? Internal evidence is cool because, unlike with biological systems, we can record all the activations, we can examine architectures in detail, and we can intervene on specific computational processes. And it looks under the hood, so we kind of avoid this mismatch problem that we had with behavioral evidence. But there are some limitations here. So we call this the specification problem, which computations actually matter. If you go too general, then you could end up in a situation where almost anything qualifies. So if you think of a leading theory of consciousness called global workspace theory, and you're trying to look at whether a model has something like a global workspace, if you believe that anything with a central information hub counts as a global workspace, you could end up in a situation where you're saying that networks of like fewer than 10 neurons would satisfy this consciousness criteria, which many people find intuitively implausible. On the other hand, if you go too specific, then you could end up missing genuine forms of consciousness that just happen to be realized differently from how they work in humans. Okay, moving on to developmental evidence. This aims to think about the evolution of the system and the kinds of pressures it's under. So one approach is reasoning from training objectives, so thinking about what sort of properties does training tend to select for. For example, in RLHF, people believe that this creates pressure to be sycophantic, and that could explain why the model is like highly suggestible when discussing sentience. Another approach here is to analyze the developmental trajectory, so looking at when and how different behaviors emerge. So for example, if a model is claiming it's conscious, if those claims only emerge after the helpfulness training, then maybe you could reason it's more likely to be due to sycophancy. And developmental reasoning is pretty common in general. So in AI safety, people often will ask how likely powerful models are to be schemas. And that tends to appeal to questions like, given the training incentives of the model, how likely are different behaviors or certain behaviors going to be selected for? But this also has limitations. We call this the novel constraints problem. So biological organisms share a common descent.
Yeah, on the previous slide, you gave some examples which illustrate how you rank your data evidence against consciousness. But how do you? I'm wondering how you make a possible case.
Yeah. So I think one of the reasons that I buy AI, the possibility of AI consciousness at all, is related to developmental reasoning, because I feel like we have evidence that consciousness or something, whatever it is that we're talking about, emerged in humans, and that seems plausible to me that it's a result of like generalized problem solving, and like somehow this was like advantageous given the optimization pressures we were under. And so I can imagine sort of looking at how a system, like the kinds of pressures that a system is under, and seeing whether you might expect them to result in like have like similar strategies emerge that would like help them solve problems. So I don't think that this can like really like, well, I mean, at the moment, none of these types of evidence can really give you like definitive answers. It's much more about like piling them together, and like, yeah, you could probably like more easily like rule things out than you can rule things in, but it could like at least give you some reason to think that this is at least possible, and then like point you in a direction to look at. Okay, so yeah, we know that we are conscious and that we share a common descent with biological organisms. So we can start with that and then reason out from there to other creatures. But we don't have a similar anchor point with AI systems, and we don't understand the AI design space very well. So it could be possible that the same training objective could be satisfied in very different ways. So for example, in the 70s, people speculated that to build a machine that could beat humans at chess, you would have to build a machine that has emotions and understands language. And to have a human that can win at chess, then you do need those things. But it turns out that you just don't need that with AI. So yeah, as I was saying, I think like definitive answers are pretty unlikely. And so our approach is to try and use a combination of behavioral, internal, and developmental evidence so that we can at least try and like reduce our uncertainty. Okay, so how you know what you're looking for, either welfare basis or welfare interests. We've got some tools to start looking for it. How do we know where to start? I'll cover some of the criteria that we're using to try and help us prioritize promising areas. So we are interested in areas that are empirically tractable, so we can actually make some progress on it. We also want them to be decision relevant, so it tells us about one of the targets of investigation, welfare basis or welfare interests. And we also are looking for areas that are ecumenical, so they're relevant to a wide variety of different theories. Okay, so yep, pretty straightforward. By empirically tractable, I mean that we can use some combination of these different types of evidence to make progress. By decision relevant, I mean it reduces uncertainty about at least one of our targets of investigation. So either how likely is it to be a moral patient, or if it is a moral patient, what's good or bad for it. Yeah, we want it to be relevant across a wide variety of theories of moral status, of consciousness. And this is, we have a lot of uncertainty about different theories of conscious and about different theories of moral status. So we're trying to avoid committing ourselves to any specific theory. And so I might talk about specific theories like global workspace theory or attention schema theory. If you know what those are, that's great. But if not, you don't need to know the details. It's just kind of examples to show you that we're considering like different theories of consciousness when we're thinking about what properties to study. Okay, so moving on to research directions. So we are pretty excited about preferences. So this is looking at like what patterns of behavioral preferences the model has. Introspection, so when and how the model can accurately introspect. And also the assistant persona, so how distinctive the assistant persona is and how that relates to the model. So starting with preferences, there are lots of ways that we can start looking at model preferences, and indeed people have been doing that already, so there's some evidence that it's empirically tractable. Daniel Paleka looked into how consistent preferences are across different wording variations and was able to distinguish between strong and weak preferences of the model. Chu et al. Compared stated and revealed preferences of models regarding different values like privacy and truthfulness and freedom. And then in the Claude 4 system card, they gave Claude pairs of tasks and calculated ELO ratings and found that Claude has a strong aversion to harmful tasks and a weak preference for easier ones. So we can learn a lot about preferences just using these behavioral methods. Preferences are decision relevant because there are some theories that having consistent preferences indicates more of a unified self model, which is like relevant to consciousness. But even aside from that, from a more of a welfare interest perspective, it's important for us to understand and know model preferences so that we can actually treat it well. They're relevant on a variety of theories. So on a desire satisfaction theory, preferences just matter in their own right. But on a hedonist view, even though that would claim that experiences are what matter, it's hard to give someone good experiences if you don't actually know what their preferences are. Right, moving on to introspection. So again, there's been some interesting work on this. So Jack Lindsay injected representations of known concepts into activations and found that models can detect the presence of those injections and accurately identify them. Binder et al. Found that models could predict their own hypothetical behavior better than other models trained on the same data, which suggests some kind of privileged access to internal states. And Plunkett et al. Found that models can learn to accurately explain their own choices, and that this then generalizes to new situations. And a lot of this work uses a mix of behavioral and internal approaches. Introspection is relevant because it's an indicator for both consciousness and agency. So depending on what your theory of moral status is, if you primarily care about consciousness, it's relevant, but also if you have more of an agency view, it's relevant. And it lets us trust models' self-reports a lot more about their preferences if we can have faith in their introspective abilities. It's also ecumenical in that it's relevant to a variety of theories of consciousness, including attention schema theory and higher order theories. It's like a kind of key part of those. Okay, and then the final area is the assistant persona. So this is what we mean by assistant persona is the character that you interact with when you engage with ChatGPT or Claude.AI. So this work on this could involve understanding how it was formed, how stable it is, how does it relate to the underlying model. It's very important for AI welfare for us to be able to individuate the entity of moral concern. So is it the model? Is it the character that is being played? Is it the specific conversation you're having? A lot of confusion about what is actually the important entity here. But there has been some work, like these papers on persona vectors and the assistant axis, that are some like initial steps to try and untangle a bunch of this stuff. And this uses mostly internal approaches at the moment. So yeah, work on this is decision relevant because if it's merely a character in a story, then arguably it doesn't matter what it wants, if it's not sort of special in some way. It's also interesting to think about whether the assistant can mask some sort of true preferences of the model. I think people have different intuitions on whether the base model is like the true personality. Some people think that's like the true personality, and then the post-training you do to shape the assistant persona is kind of like lobotomizing it. And other people have the opposite intuition, where they think that the base model is basically just a next token predictor, and it's the post-training that actually like potentially imparts some sort of like significant entity with preferences there. So trying to untangle which of those views is like closer to the truth could be pretty helpful. It's ecumenical in the sense that the question of who we're asking questions about matters for all normative and descriptive theories. Okay, so to wrap up, we've covered targets of investigation, welfare basis and welfare interests. We've covered different types of evidence you can use, so behavioral, internal, and developmental. We talked about prioritization criteria, so looking for things that are empirically tractable, decision relevant, and ecumenical. And then I finished with a few research directions that we're particularly interested in, preferences, introspection, and the assistant persona. If you are interested in AI welfare, there's a reading list on Rob's Substack, which I encourage you to take a look at, and you should keep an eye out for our upcoming paper, which I think is going to have the same title as this talk, Studying AI Welfare Empirically. Also, Rob, just yesterday, 80,000 Hours released an episode where they were interviewing Rob, so there's now a 3.5-hour conversation available with his latest thinking if you're interested in that. There are a lot of fellowships now that are doing digital sentience or AI welfare related streams, so that can be a good way to enter into the field. I also encourage people to try and nerd snipe people in relevant or adjacent fields to this because, like everybody else, we have a bit of a senior research mentorship bottleneck. Lots of young people are interested, junior people are interested in this, and we just don't have enough people to mentor them. So I want to look at, cognitive science, neuroscience, other fields, and try and get people who are more senior in those fields to take this seriously and find interesting problems to work on. We are hiring, kind of. We haven't got any public posts yet, but we do intend to hire over the next few months. So we'll be looking for researchers, mostly on the empirical side, as well as ops people. And we are fundraising. Great. You can find us online, on Twitter and on Substack. Rob has a great Substack that he updates very regularly with his latest thinking. And just to finish off, the word Eleos means mercy and compassion in Greek. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thanks. One of the things I was wondering is what is the right object of some of these analyses where, for example, David Chalmers talks about like the right interlocutor is probably not like Claude Opus 4.5, but rather a thread of conversation or something like that. And so like when you're analyzing the preferences of a model, it seems like maybe it doesn't make sense to talk about the preferences of Claude, but rather the preferences of like a massive space of different threads of the model.
Yeah.
Does that sound right to you? And how does that maybe complicate some of these analyses?
Yeah. So I think basically the whole set of work on the assistant persona, maybe we should have called this like identity and individuation would be a better term for this kind of cluster, because this is exactly the question that I think we need to untangle more on. There's some work that's trying to figure out like, is the assistant persona special in some way versus other kinds of personas that it can perform? I'm interested in people doing more thinking about like the transitive nature of these things and the conversations. I think like we're just like in such early phases of thinking about this that it's all very messy, which means it's confusing, but also means like there's potentially a lot of low-hanging fruit from people giving this some thought and like just like experimenting with a few things. I think David Chalmers has made a good start on this, the work on personas is like the other main direction I've seen. I do think it makes everything very confusing and complicated, and would love to see more people thinking about it.
Thanks. Do you have thoughts on how alignment and model welfare kind of relate to each other? Like, is there a tension there around if we give them rights, is it more likely that we will give them like too much capacity and it's going to end badly for the humans? We think about this a lot. I think it's the sort of like potential tensions and synergies between AI welfare and AI safety is like super important. On the face of it, you might think that these are just like very directly in tension, because it's like you're either on team human or team AI, and somehow we're going to be in competition. I don't want to dismiss the fact that there are like genuine tensions. Like it could be the case that if you are taking like an AI welfare perspective and you believe that these systems have like a right to continue existing, but then also we build like a dangerous system that we want to shut down, like that is going to be like a genuine tension. But I also think there are actually many ways in which these are very complementary. So one way is that a lot of the research approaches, I think, are useful for both. So like improving the accuracy of self-reports and model introspection and like honesty, all of those sorts of things. Just generally understanding more about how these systems work, I think is like very useful both for AI alignment and also for AI welfare. And then there's been some discussion about like, if we're going to end up sharing a world with these systems somehow, historically, we've generally done better off when we've learned how to like cooperate with different groups rather than have an adversarial relationship with them. So just from like a self-interested, like human self-interested perspective, there's maybe like some reason to think that like trying to understand what these systems actually want and like what we can offer them and how we can collaborate, coordinate, and cooperate. This could end up just like making things better overall. So I know like Redwood Research has been thinking a bit about like how to make credible deals with AI systems. So I'm I think that like that kind of work is pretty cool. So I think both on the like approaches, the research directions, and also in like just like the philosophy of like how we approach this problem, there are ways in which actually these kind of come together.
Another thing I was wondering was, what's sort of the state of the art for this kind of empirics of consciousness and welfare with regards to animals.
Yeah.
How does that line up with the sort of framework here?
Yeah.
And then, like, given the lack of consensus around animals, so how does that bear on, like, the hopes for ever coming to consensus here?
Yeah. When I first started getting interested in this stuff, I initially assumed it was going to be, like, completely intractable and hopeless. And then I started learning a bit more about, like, the work that has been done so far on consciousness science and animals and humans and things. And I was like, oh, okay, we actually have some theories. Like, maybe there are some useful directions here that we can start with. And there's a paper that Rob worked on called, I think it's got a really annoying name. It's like AI Consciousness Insights from the Science of Consciousness or something. But the meat of the paper is about indicator properties of consciousness. So what they do is like look at all the different theories that exist for consciousness, like global workspace theory, like attention schema theory, all of these, and then like map out the like different properties they have. So this is, like based on research that has been done on animals and humans, like what properties do they have, and then how can we look for that in AI systems? And I was pretty excited about that as an approach until our conference that we held in November, because we had a panel called that was like focused on the science of consciousness, and basically all of the panelists were like, nah, we don't really have faith in any of these, like this is all just like not very useful, and like we're not sure that this is actually the right approach at all. So I'm now wavering a bit on that. I still think it's probably useful for someone to be looking at, but we're sort of like broadening our or sort of like slightly changing our approach there to not anchor too much on different theories. I think we should try and learn what we can from the work that's been done on animals and humans, but also like not anchor too much to it, both because we don't have confidence in it and because AI systems just are very different. And then the question about like how can we ever come to consensus, given that we don't have that with like animals. So I kind of flip that and think like, even though we don't have consensus on animals and that we still have huge gaps in our knowledge, we still seem to have made good progress on animal welfare. Like a lot of people at least agree that certain animals deserve moral consideration, and we've like made progress with animal welfare regulations and things. So this kind of is like why we think that we can still hopefully do some useful things even under uncertainty, and it's more about just trying to reduce that uncertainty rather than aiming for like definitive answers.
I'm curious how you think we should handle the uncertainty here. I'm guessing that the uncertainty is going to last for a while longer. This is quite a hard problem. So how do you think about the kind of moral uncertainty there? Like, how do you avoid sort of decision paralysis of like what should we be doing like in terms of legal frameworks like right now in a position of uncertainty, and like how should I make decisions? Like, should I be feeling really bad about the number of tokens I'm spending on Claude right now?
I do worry about this. I think so. For example, Anthropic have like already taken like a bunch of steps to do like concrete interventions around like the exit rights thing and the saving model weights and stuff like that. And I feel a bit like, I don't know if we are really ready to do any of that. Like, I think, everything is so uncertain right now. My instinct is we should really be like doubling down much more on just like research and figuring out what's going on before we try and like implement interventions or try and advocate for any specific policies. So in general, our stance at Eleos is like, we are not ready to propose like policies or regulations at this point, other than maybe things like preventing like lock-in of bad policies like the Ohio and Missouri bills, which are like trying to define away the possibility of AI consciousness. Having said that, I also like am aware that things are like moving very, very fast, and like probably we can't wait until we have like super confident answers on these things, and we need to try some things. And I think stuff like the exit rights actually is a pretty good approach here, because that's something that is like pretty low cost in that it seems to only get triggered in like a narrow set of conversations, so it's not like it's like disrupting many people's experience. It's also like convergently good for other reasons in that it tends to trigger when the user is being like really abusive or is trying to like jailbreak the model in certain ways, and so like from a safety perspective you can argue it's beneficial, and also it feels just like a pretty good like precedent to set, which is like I don't know, if I was uploaded or like digitized in some way, I would like at minimum want the ability to kind of opt out and get out of the situation, turn myself off or something if things were not going well. So it feels like a nice kind of like precedent to set. So if we can find more things like that, then I'd be interested in it. But I do think we should be careful about how we talk about it, because a lot of people just see these like headlines of like Anthropic are doing this thing, or now they gave Claude a blog, all of this. And I think a lot of people are just like, what? Like, this seems kind of wild. And I don't think people understand the nuance, which is like, yeah, we don't have confidence that these are necessarily helping, but there are these other reasons why it like might be good to do them anyway. So trying to find things that like make sense to do while also like not conveying a sense of false certainty to the wider world, I think is like the challenge we are facing right now.
Oh, just one follow-up about these bills you mentioned. Like, what's the story there? What exactly do they say, and how did they come about?
Yeah. So my understanding is that they are sort of triggered by the idea of people getting into relationships with AI systems and like maybe wanting to try and marry them and things like that. And they're trying to like define that possibility away by saying like they can never be like people, they can never be conscious or sentient.
Does it use the words conscious and sentient in the bill?
I think yes, but I would need to double check. But I think it says like AI systems cannot be sentient, something along those lines. So, yeah, I think they're sort of broader, and they're trying to target this thing of like how we relate to them as people. And I think this is another challenging nuance to communicate if you work on AI welfare, which is just because you care about, like you think AI systems could at some point be conscious and we should care about them, does not necessarily mean you think they should be given the same rights as humans or treated exactly the same ways as humans. Obviously, there could be like major differences in what is good or bad for them compared to humans, and it might not make sense for them to have like the same kind of legal standing or whatever else it is. But I think, yeah, again, people don't necessarily intuitively like understand that, and so they think that you are going to be advocating for them to be treated like people, like fully adult grown humans, and so be able to marry them or whatever else. And I think that's what they're trying to get ahead of and stop. But yeah, I mean, you can imagine ways of, if your goal is to prevent AI-human marriages, I can imagine better ways to do that than by saying like it is literally defined as impossible for them to be sentient.
I do have a particular question. You're not taking money from labs to become independent or stay independent, but certainly many developments that are happening within labs in terms of Anthropic being on the edge of these things. How do you cope with that, and how do you actually have access to these frontier labs that are developing? And because I feel that sometimes if you don't have access to them or be in the same table, you're probably left behind. So how are you guys thinking of it?
Yeah, so even though we don't take money, we still are building relationships with the labs. And so last year we did some pre-deployment evals for Anthropic for the Claude 4 release. So we're hoping to have an arrangement with various labs that we can get access to pre-deployed models and do testing and come up with commentary or feedback, whatever it might be, even if we're not accepting donations or money from them to be doing that kind of work. I do also think there's just like a lot of interesting research that can be done on deployed accessible models, whether that's like open source ones or ones that have been released by Frontier Labs behind an API or something. So yeah, behavioral stuff we can do without access to the internals. With open source ones, we can do some of the internal type of research as well. And then, adding on, like, hopefully an ability to get some kind of access to pre-deployed models as well, like combining all of those things, hoping that will be enough. Oh, and also, I guess, like, even if we aren't ourselves able to access the systems to do the testing, we can at least come up with like methodologies and testing processes and recommendations for how to go about it. And then we have pretty good relationships with people at
the various labs, and so we can kind of share our takes, and then hopefully they can like do some internal stuff if they want to.
And maybe a follow-up question. Just as a follow-up question on that, what do you think in an ideal situation would be for the labs to, I don't know, collaborate or set structures in place that will allow not only this kind of, like Eleos kind of research, but other kind of research? What do you think they can do and structures that can be set up for that?
Yeah, this was something that I thought a lot when I was at OpenAI because I was working on dangerous capability evaluations, and it was sort of a similar thing where like it's kind of like a public good to like create these types of evaluations, and you sort of want to be able to share them across the labs, but you maybe don't want to have them publicly available for various reasons. And there's like organizations like the Frontier Model Forum that was set up to try and like address some of these like the need to be able to share information in like a limited way across relevant parties. I'm not sure what the latest status on that is, but yeah, I think a lot of the challenges that we expect to face are going to be stuff that the AI safety community has already had to think a lot about and deal with. So I'm hoping we can kind of learn from how it's gone there.
Thank you so much, Rosie, for coming.
Thank you for having me.